This presentation covers violent and nonviolent protests during the Apartheid. Beginning with nonviolent protests. The Defiance Campaign was the first in a number of coordinated nationwide campaigns and protests organized by the ANC against the apartheid system, marking the opening for a more racial phase in the struggle against white minority rule. It was designed to apply concentrated pressure on the government and force it into repealing apartheid legislation and negotiating with the ANC. The campaign's methodology relied on harnessing political potential of the masses and ordinary Africans in a coordinated campaign, a philosophy on nonviolent civil disobedience, hopefully causing the arrest of thousands, thus stretching the institutions of state repression such as the police, courts, and prisons to a breaking point, and forming an alliance with the South African Indian Congress, also known as the SAIC. Civil disobedience is a key concept here. It is the strategy of protesting against unjust laws by deliberately breaking them, usually using non-violent means. The approach was outlined by the American writer and philosopher Henry James Thoreau in the 19th century and was used among others by Mahatma Gandhi in his struggle against the British rule and by Martin Luther King during the civil rights struggle in the United States. In June 1952, a National Actions Committee, the NAC, was created to organize this campaign. The NAC consisted of representatives of the ANC, the South African Indian Congress, and the Franchise Action Council, a colored organization created in order to protest the NP government's decision to remove color from the voters' roll. A National Volunteers Board, the NVB, was created to coordinate the protest, and Nelson Mandela was appointed National Volunteer-in-Chief as well as chairman of both the NAC and the NVB, so he was all over the place. Small groups of volunteers including Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Yusuf Dadoo, Moses Kotane, and J.B. Marks deliberately defied apartheid laws in front of crowds. Volunteers and onlookers sang songs of freedom, and once they were arrested, they gave their supporters a thumbs up sign. A significant factor in this growth and in the overall success of the campaign was the involvement of women. Many of the protesters were female, and the ANC Women's League was the forefront of organizing acts of defiance. The Black Sash, a group of white women opposed to apartheid, supported the campaign with great enthusiasm. However, the campaign didn't last long. The government introduced a Criminal Laws Amendment Act in 1953, which allowed the courts to hand out longer sentences and introduce whipping as a punishment for offenses committed by ways of protests. There were multiple failures. No laws were repealed, no outright participation was actually achieved, success from the NP government was imminent, and there was almost no white engagement. The few successes that they had was that it was the first extended national campaign. The volunteer turnout was pretty good. There was a lot of interest group participations, particularly from colored interest groups. It started a global profile for the ANC. Again, this allowed them to become involved with the United Nations later on, and the United Nations Commission on the Racial Situation in the Union of South Africa was instituted in 1953. The Congress of the People, the COP, convened in 1955. It was an alliance of anti-apartheid Congress people. Its mission was to forge a single popular front by uniting all of South African racial groups. The Congress of the People, or the COP, convened in 1955, was an alliance of anti-apartheid Congress movement. Its mission was to forge a single popular front by uniting all South Africa's racial groups, expand the membership of the ANC, and draft a freedom charter for the COP, a document which would encapsulate the political goals of the Congress movements as well as the democratic aspirations of all the people of South Africa. The National Council Group was established in order to organize the COP. The ANC would recruit thousands of freedom volunteers whose task it would be to bring the COP to the masses. Its endorsements were basically the following. I'm not going to name them all, you have them on the slide. pause them and read them. Composed in ringing declamatory tones, the Freedom Charter became the iconic document of the freedom struggle. It called for an end to the apartheid system, the election of a democratic, non-racial government, and the equitable distribution of the country's wealth and resources. In a mass meeting held at the football team in Cliptown, it was unanimously adopted. The Cliptown rally ended in chaos, however, with armed police raiding the meeting. The government planned to use these documents as evidence against the ANC leaders in the next phase of its battle against the resistance movement. The treason trial took an enormous toll on the movement since the Freedom Charter was deemed treason to the state, and this further led to the Rivonia trials, which we'll see later on. Bus boycotts were a major form of black protest against the South African authorities even prior to 1948. This was similar in the United States for the civil rights movement. The causes were economic due to the raised fares to the cities and the low wages paid to Africans and increasingly high unemployment that was permeated within the African community. However, the boycotts were often successful. The Johannesburg Chamber of Commerce, mindful of the impact of the boycotts on businesses, would typically intervene in a dispute and persuade the bus companies to resign the fare increases. And so usually the Africans would win in these situations because it was an economic issue, not a social one. The boycott was viewed as a major threat by the apartheid government. This was not a campaign that had been planned or initiated by the ANC or any other political party, and for that reason it seemed all the more dangerous. The most important of all the boycotts was the famous Alexandra bus boycott, which began in January 1957. Predictably enough, it was triggered by the decision of the bus company PUTCO to raise fares from the township into the city from 4 to 5 pence. The resulting demonstration were on a scale unlike anything seen before in the country, with hundreds of thousands involved in the boycott, and for the first time widespread and often sympathetic coverage in the white media. All in all, around 70,000 people walked daily for 12 weeks. Ultimately, the Johannesburg Chamber of Commerce felt obliged to intervene, and the fares were lowered. Moving on to violent protest, we're going to be covering the Sharpeville Massacre. This massacre took place on the 21st of March of 1960, when white policemen opened fire on a crowd of demonstrators outside a police station at a township on the outskirts of Berening, some around 60 kilometers south of Johannesburg. 69 armed protesters were killed, 189 were injured. Its main result was the decision of the ANC to abandon its strategy of peaceful resistance to apartheid and instead embrace armed struggle. The origins of Sharpeville can be traced in the split of the ANC in 1959. Africanists within the ANC, with their slogan of Africa for Africans, believed that the best hope of liberation was through political self-reliance and a cultural focus that was rooted in African beliefs and tradition. So the ANC splits into this Pan-Africanist movement. The Africanists believed that all of the land and wealth of the South Africa must be returned to its original black owners. The breakaway Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, led by Robert Sobukwe, was officially formed in 1959 in an attempt to hijack the peaceful demonstration of the ANC. The PAC organized a protest outside the police station in Sharpeville. Large numbers of people then moved towards the fence compound of the police station, demanding that they be permitted to enter and surrounded themselves for arrest. Again, they weren't carrying their papers. Police reports differ from that of demonstrators, but the chain reaction of events led to gunfire, and we had all the casualties that I just mentioned. The government's response to the escalating crisis was typically bold, and a state of emergency was declared on March 1960, and thousands of ANC and PAC leaders were arrested, all for political reasons, and any gatherings were outlawed. On April 8th, after passing the Unlawful Organization Act, the government officially banned the two resistant movements. After the Sharpeville massacre, the country's international isolation began in earnest. Economic sanctions were applied for the first time, despite the refusal of South Africa's major trading partners, Britain and the United States, to agree to a global trade embargo. There was strong pressure from newly independent states, which led to South Africa being forced out of the British Commonwealth. So there were a lot of international setbacks for this massacre. Its first major diplomatic setback. This was the first major diplomatic setback for the NP, and basically this led to the South Africa becoming a republic in 1961. Mandela, by now a fugitive on the run from the authorities, and himself long convinced of the necessity of armed struggle, finally managed to persuade the ANC leadership at a secret party congress in 1961 to create another group. By the end of the year, the armed wing of the movement, Umkhonto we Sizwe, or also known as the MK, this is their symbol, was created. It immediately began its sabotage operations against the apartheid state. Finalizing with this violent protest, we also have the Rivonia Trial, which basically led to major detriments for the anti-apartheid movement because most of their leaders were arrested and sent to prison for life. The Rivonia Trial of 1963 to 1964 was named after the suburb in northern Johannesburg where the resistance movement's safe house, Liliesleaf Farm, was located. This residence was used by senior leaders of the ANC and the SACP, many who had been on the run from the authorities. It also became the operational headquarters for MK. After a tip-off, it was no more. All MK leaders were arrested while examining a document entitled Operation Mayibuye, a detailed plan for a revolutionary guerrilla war to be waged by MK from clandestine bases in rural parts of the country. 11 defendants were put in trial for treason. The main law under which defendants were charged was the Sabotage Act of 1962. This law defined sabotage as a capital offense, and the chief prosecutor, Percy Dutar, called for the death penalty. Mandela and his co-accused agreed that they would freely admit to the charge of sabotage. However, they denied that any lives had been put at risk by their campaign. Their strategy was to politicize the trial by arguing that their struggle was morally legitimate, conducted on behalf of the people of South Africa for freedom and democracy, and against racial domination and oppression. They tried to pull the ethos card. As the trial drew to an end in June 1964, hundreds of journalists, photographers, and diplomats from around the world descended on the court building in Pretoria. On June 9th, the UN Security Council passed a resolution calling on the government to end the trial and offer an amnesty to all of the accused. Just 4 countries, the USA, France, Britain, and Brazil, abstained from the vote. However, on June 11th, Justice Quartes de Wet delivered his verdict. With the exception of Lionel Bernstein, all of the accused were found guilty of all charges. To the surprise of everyone, the judge sentenced them to life imprisonment at the maximum security prison in Robben Island. Here we have a picture of the prison. The Rivonia Trial marked the end of an era in the struggle against apartheid. The government had successfully broken the ANC and the MK. There would be little to threaten to the security of the apartheid state until the Soweto uprising of 1976. After the trial, Mr. Oliver Tambo became the effective leader of the ANC in exile. But not much was done until, again, the 70s. New political movements were born, and these provided renewed energy and focus for opposition. This included Steve Biko's South African Students Organization and the Black Consciousness Movement, which we already talked about. And by the 1970s, the United Front was created, and this led to the struggle to end by the 1980s. But this was a long time after Mandela was imprisoned. It wasn't until then, until the 1980s, that the NP tentatively began to end the apartheid system. But it was, again, a very gradual process. Here's just a little GIF of the different protests that were happening in the anti-apartheid movement. And thank you to Mark Rogers and Peter Clinton for their information. And we hereby recognize the authors of the visual content of this presentation. Thank you so much.